Hey everybody, I have COVID, so this recording is going to probably be a little rough. There's probably going to be some hacking, some wheezing, some sneezing, all kinds of gross things, but you're going to have to live with it, because the show must go on, baby. This is chapter 8 of Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels. The chapter is titled The Origins of Engels' Communism. When Engels left the continent to journey to England in November 1842, Engels was already a communist. In actuality, Engels' transition to communism occurred during the first half of 1842. In March of 1842, Engels began to write for Marx's Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and in June also for Arnold Ruge's young Hegelian periodical, Deutsche Jahrbucher. In his 1841 letter to Ruge, Engels had indicated that he wished to suspend his career in journalism in order to devote an extended period to the study of philosophy. In less than a year, Engels had again returned to journalism. Engels did not give himself the prolonged and concentrated period of study that would lead to mastery of the subject. From the point of view of his avocation, however, Engels' residence in Berlin during 1841, the year of his military service as an artillery officer, brought great dividends to Engels. Through the friendships he made in Berlin with the young Hegelian luminaries, Engels had gained entrance into fashionable intellectual circles. By 1842, Engels was writing for the more sophisticated radical journals. Engels' decision for communism stemmed from the experiences and associations Engels gained from his work with the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. In this respect, the figure of Moses Hess was crucial. With Hess as the primary influence, Engels changed from a liberal nationalist to a revolutionary communist. Engels' former expectation that a national revolution would bring in its stead political liberalism was now replaced by the hope that a social revolution would bring political unification. By the end of 1842, the social question had assumed paramount importance in Engels' list of priorities. There was no means of revolution, no mention of the nationalization of property in any of Engels' writing up to 1842. It was only when Engels became a communist that he also became a revolutionary. Quote, already in August 1842, some of the party fought for their view that political changes would be insufficient and expanded that, according to their opinion, a social revolution on the foundation of the common ownership of property should be the basic societal condition, which they fitted with their abstract principles. However, even the leaders of the party, for example, Dr. Bruno Bauer, Dr. Feuerbach, Dr. Ruge, were at the same time not ready for this decisive step. The political organ of the party, the Rheinische Zeitung, published some essays that advocated communism, but not with this expected success. Nevertheless, communism was such a necessary consequence of neo-Hegelian philosophy that no opposition was able to repress it, and in the course of the year the founders had the satisfaction to see one Republican after another join their ranks. In addition to Dr. Hess, one of the editors of the now repressed Rheinische Zeitung, who in fact was the first communist in the party, there were also many others, as Dr. Ruge, publisher of the Deutsche Jahrbucher, the scientific periodical of the young Hegelians, which was repressed by the decision of the German Reichstag. Dr. Marx, also an editor of the Rheinische Zeitung. Georg Herweg, the poet, his letters to the King of Prussia have been translated during the past winter in most English newspapers, and many others, and we hope that the remainder of the Republican Party would gradually come over to us, end quote. Engels basically learned his communism from Moses Hess. It was Hess who made Engels aware that modern society was polarized between, quote, pauperism, end quote, and the, quote, aristocracy of gold, end quote. In short, Moses Hess acquainted Engels with the fact that property defined class lines in the 19th century society, and that the struggle for possession of property was the basis for class conflict in that century. Only the destruction of private property could relieve the economic slavery of the pauper. Hess saw England as the classic example of social polarization, the confrontation between rich and poor. English capitalism had concentrated both production and commerce in the hands of a propertied aristocracy, thus occasioning the extreme suffering of the poor. Impressed by the Chartists, Hess believed England on the verge of a revolution. Political reforms could not answer the needs of the English proletariat. The revolution must be social in nature, that is, fundamentally alter property relations. Sensitive to national differences, Hess felt that communism was a product of German, French, and English cultural traditions. Speculative and introspective, the Germans had given communism its philosophical foundation. Having a revolutionary tradition, the French had imparted to communism its political attributes. Particularly, the land of the Industrial Revolution, the English had contributed to communism its economic dimensions. The rebirth of European culture and society on the basis of communism, on the destruction of private property, will be achieved through the consolidation of these three unique national traditions. Pure egoism and pure egoism's corollary, private property, would be abolished in the next stage, the communist stage of European development. Heinrich Heine and Wilhelm Weitling had influenced Hess. In his Religion and Philosophy in Germany, Heine was one of the first to call for the unity of German metaphysics, French radicalism, and English empiricism. Heine felt that such a cultural synthesis had revolutionary implications for European society. In his book, Garantien der Harmonie und Freiheit, Wilhelm Weitling had argued that the origin of inequality between men lay in the unequal apportionment of wealth. Engels himself was to call Weitling, quote, the founder of German communism, end quote. Furthermore, it was Weitling who saw in the laboring classes the force that would eventually destroy the differences between rich and poor by abolishing property. Thus Engels, through his association with Hess, was exposed to the wider currents of European radicalism. Above all, Engels had learned that it was the poor who were going to act as the destroyers of private property. If Engels acquired his belief in the poor as a revolutionary force from Hess, Engels learned his egalitarianism from Gracchus Babeuf. It was Babeuf who termed equality the basis of all just societies. Therefore, Babeuf maintained, every person should partake of equal shares of labor, equal shares of enjoyment, and have an equal amount of goods distributed to him. Babeuf was an economic egalitarian. Communism, for Babeuf, meant pure equality. Engels' brand of communism was decidedly Babeufist. In Fortschritt der Sozialreform auf dem Kontinent, Engels was to write that, quote, pure freedom and pure equality was communism, end quote. For Engels, communism would always imply equal distribution to the entire population of things that was produced by the industrial machine. Economic egalitarianism, the distribution of equal shares to all, was a paramount feature of what Engels defined as communism. The third major influence on Engels at this period of his life was Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon, who was the prophet of industrial society. It was Saint-Simon who was the prophet of industrial society. It was Saint-Simon who felt that poverty could be eradicated through industrial productivity, the creation of a technocracy, the placing of the limitless power of modern industry into the hands of professional managers, would bring forth such a plethora of goods that poverty, the existence of the poor, would be finally ended. Technological growth formed the core of Saint-Simon's social theory. There was a latent positivism in Saint-Simon's thought. The age of agriculture was to be superseded by the age of industrial modernization. Technological growth was a pervasive feature of Engels' definition of communism. In fact, communism, for Engels, could not be attained unless the productive industrial forces of society had reached a high stage of development. Thus, technology itself, for Engels, as for Saint-Simon, would be the ultimate reason for the overcoming of poverty and consequently the transcendence of class. There was a latent positivism in Engels' thought pattern. Capitalism had necessarily superseded the age of agriculture, but capitalism was distinguished as an age of industrial scarcity. Communism was merely a product of technological growth, and in a communist society there would be a change from capitalistic scarcity to industrial abundance, and, as a consequence, equal distribution or economic egalitarianism. Engels' communism, then, was an amalgam of Saint-Simonian technocracy, Babeufist economic egalitarianism, Hessian belief that the poor would seize the means of production. It was in terms of this structure, in terms of this group of core ideas, that Engels was to interpret English society and history when he was residing in that country. Moreover, this amalgam of technocracy, economic egalitarianism, and pauper revolutionism was to remain throughout his life the major feature of Engelsian communism. A product of his own history and style, Engelsian communism was a unique personal expression. When Engels arrived in England, he again acted as a part-time reporter. While working for Armand and Engels, his family's cotton factory in Manchester, Engels wrote articles for continental periodicals describing social conditions in England. Instead of commenting on literature, philosophy, and religion, Engels was now commenting on the Chartists, the Corn Laws, the English Constitution. Although Engels' function remained the same, that of a publicist, the content of his reporting had drastically changed. He was not interested in Schelling or Berne, but rather in the environmental conditions of the land of the Industrial Revolution. Engels began writing economics and sociology rather than philosophical cultural essays. Like Hess, Engels was fully cognizant of the different national traditions of the three Western European powers. The French, perpetuating the spirit of Greco-Roman materialism, had executed the revolution in a political fashion. The Germans, a Christian spiritualist people, had experienced the revolution in the revolution's philosophic form. The English, however, combining both French and German elements, were the only Western people to have lived through a social revolution. Throughout his first residence, Engels was convinced that England was on the verge of revolution. In fact, the revolution had been in progress for 200 years. The beginning of industry, the creation of the proletariat, had brought far-reaching changes to England and pitted proletariat against bourgeoisie. The denouement of their class conflict was not too far off. The English Revolution, in contrast to the French, had been and would be social rather than political. The change from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, the change from agrarian labor to industrial wage labor, had all taken place outside the boundaries of the state. A new society had come into being in England, and this new society was now pushing against the institutions of an older political structure. Thus, Engels was describing the dysfunction between political forms and actual social content. But this new awareness on the part of Engels of the importance of the social did not mean that Engels understood society as Marx. Engels did not conceive of the state as a form of alienated human essence, because he did not conceive of society as representing the species being of man. For Engels, the state was a mechanism of repression in the hands of those who possessed property, just as society was practice dictated to people by the necessities of industrial property. Society, for Engels, was not human essence, but rather custom imposed by the techniques, tools, instruments of production. In 1842, Engels became a materialist, because only materialism could supply answers to the problems of social distress and pauperism. The awareness that Engels gained in 1842 of the struggle between rich and poor predisposed Engels to see England as a class society. Political parties, politics in general, were simply an expression of social class. In Engels' lexicon, however, class itself was defined by possession of property. The possession or lack of possession of wealth placed one either in the middle classes or in the poorer classes. Class, according to Engels, also defined politics. Engels described English society as composed of three great politics. Engels described English society as composed of three great classes. The Tories had their wealth in land, the Whigs had their wealth in industry and commerce, and the proletariat had no wealth at all. Even though the Whigs and the Tories received their wealth from different sources, the Whigs and the Tories were wealthy in equal proportion and thus composed the middle classes. England was then a tyranny of the middle class. The activity of possession, the socio-political influence of possession, was clearly manifested in the struggle over the Corn Law. Quote, the nobility knew that its power, outside the constitutional framework of the House of Lords, derived chiefly from its wealth, end quote, and were therefore opposed to the repeal of the corn tariff. The nobility were afraid that a reduction of the corn tariff would lead to a reduction of ground rents. Since loss of rents would mean loss of wealth, and the loss of wealth would mean loss of social power, the Tories fought politically to retain the corn tariff. The manufacturing classes, on the other hand, wished to increase their wealth by paying less wages. Repeal of the corn tariff meant that the price of bread would fall, giving the manufacturer an excuse not to increase or even to lower his wages. The incentive for greater wealth encouraged the Whigs to vote for repeal. The poor, of course, wanted prices to be as low as possible, and so radicals and Chartists advocated total free trade. Engels saw the Chartists as representing the English proletariat. As a proletarian movement, however, the Chartists had gained little support among English intellectuals. Chartism, furthermore, was not a socialist movement. Rather, Chartism was a, quote, radical democratic, end quote, movement. Socialists in England did not as yet form a political party. Wherever adherents of socialism existed, adherents of socialism could be found in the lower middle classes and among small segments of the proletariat. Furthermore, the Chartists were not basically a revolutionary movement. The Chartists talked of achieving power legally, of a, quote, legal revolution. Engels called this a, quote, impossibility, end quote, and indicated that a revolutionary movement whose aim was the overthrow of the aristocracy, the smashing of the old establishment, could only accomplish this aim through violence. Unless the Chartists were prepared to use violence, and they were not, their expectations of seizing power were a chimera. On the other hand, the the social revolution was a certainty for England. Chartism, although it would not affect the revolution, was a good preparation. The proletariat had learned through the Chartist movement. The proletariat was now radical democratic and bound to a stultifying sense of legality. However, with increasing periods of depression, when bread was scarce and hunger plentiful, the proletariat would be further radicalized. With starvation before him, the proletariat would learn in the future that his own best interests were served through the seizure of property and through the use of violence to accomplish the expropriation of the means of production. Whether the Chartists drew their support from a true proletariat, industrial workers, does not concern us. Of more importance was the way Engels described the coming into being of what he considered the proletariat. The first step in this process was the rise of religious individualism during the Reformation. The religious principles of inwardness, of subjectivity, triumphed during the Reformation. Later, the principle of subjectivity, when applied to the social world, was translated into the doctrine of pure self-interest. Quote, "For the interest is essentially subjective, egoistic, individual interest, and, as such, is the epitome of the German Christian subjective and individualization principle." End quote. Modern egoism was thus the completion and perfection of Christianity. But modern egoism had led to the isolation and atomization of man in society. This fragmentation of the social universe into isolated persons was again the last consequence of the Christian doctrine of subjectivity. Private property was simply another expression of this modern egoism. Consequently, men had become slaves to property. Since property ruled the world, men now bow before the new god, money. The second step in the rise of capitalism in England was the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Man had begun his mastery over nature. Philosophically, man's conquest of nature resulted in the triumph of materialism. Practically, man's mastery of the natural was manifest in the technological advances of the 18th century. The English were a practical empirical people. The interconnection of abstract science and its practical application formed the basis of the technological revolution of the 18th century. Furthermore, technological changes brought forth social changes. Quote, "We have seen that the introduction of mechanical devices and general scientific principles were the engines of progress." End quote. I don't know if I said the first quote, so I'll repeat that. Quote, "We have seen that the introduction of mechanical devices and general scientific principles were the engines of progress." End quote. In other words, technology was the primary causal factor in social history. The third step in the evolution of capitalism in England was the creation of the proletariat. Here again, the revolution in industrial technique brought forth the proletariat, the entire reorganization of English social classes. As a result of the coming of the machine, England divided into three classes, quote, "the aristocracy of land, the aristocracy of money, and the working democracy," end quote. It was this, quote, "working democracy," end quote, that was being prepared by the Chartist movement to eventually seize the means of production. The proletariat must cease being radical Democrats in the Chartist sense and become socialist. Only socialism could cure the problems of England, because the problems that confronted England were not political, but decidedly social. A more insightful glimpse into Engels' socioeconomic understanding at this stage of his life can be gotten by dividing his thinking on this matter into categories. Engels' account of the evolution of capitalism in England will take on greater significance once we have a clearer comprehension of each of the following conceptual categories. 1. Property. 2. Competition. 3. Industrial growth. 4. Value. 5. The proletariat. 6. The theory of cataclysm and revolution. And 7. Communism. New section. Property. Private property was the creation of industry. Private property had not always existed. At the end of the Middle Ages, the development of machine manufacture required a new form of property relationship. The property relationships of the Middle Ages could not accommodate machine manufacture. The property relationship that could accommodate industry was private property. Thus, every change in society, the creation of new property relationships, was brought into existence by an initial change in the forces of production. It divided the natural conditions of production with the human activity of production. The soil and tools upon which and with which men labored were separated from the human force of labor. Property, by removing the natural conditions of production from the free access of all men, separated the natural and human species of production. Furthermore, property divided labor itself in two. Labor was at once activity and wages. The product of labor, i.e. wages, confronted the laborer who was inherently free. What the fuck? Furthermore, property divided labor itself in two. Labor was at once activity and wages. The product of labor, i.e. wages, confronted the laborer who was inherently free activity. Sentence doesn't make sense. Property separated labor from labor's own satisfactions. In short, property separated capital and labor. By dividing labor and by dividing production, property tended to isolate individuals and create conflicts. Labor was opposed to capitalist. Capitalist was opposed to landowner, and laborer confronted laborer. Because it divided men, property led to discord. Because it divided men, property led to class conflict. Property, as we have seen above, formed the basis of the social classes. It was the ground for the distinction between rich and poor. Trade was also an outgrowth of property. Quote, the immediate consequence of private property is trade, exchange of reciprocal demand, buying and selling, end quote. Competition, too, is an outgrowth of property. In the course of trade, a buyer and a seller faced each other. The object of the duel between the buyer and seller was profit for the seller. He must sell as dearly as possible. Property occasioned trade, and the contest of trade was carried on for profit. The destruction of private property then meant the disappearance of the division in production and the division in labor. The division in production and the divisions, plural, in labor. It meant the end of the artificial isolation of man from man. It meant the abolition of profit and the termination of competition. It meant the overthrow of classes. With the destruction of property, the unity of the natural side of production with the human side would be achieved, and a man's labor would become truly his self-rewarding activity. Property, then, was the basic cause of human atomization. It was the cause of the war of all against all. New section. Competition. In his Outline of a Critique of Political Economy, Engels defined competition as the rule that, quote, each must seek to sell as dear as possible and buy as cheap as possible, end quote. Competition then could be understood as economic self-interest. Competition, which was an expression of private property, meant that the desire for economic gain would compel the owner of property to increase the value of that property. The rise of the proletariat was a function of competition. Economic self-interest compelled the peasant to surrender the livelihood of the land, to seek the higher wages of a weaver. The desire for economic gain also meant that peasants would drift into the towns in search of higher wages. Conversely, competition not only created the proletariat, but also the capitalist. The economic self-aggrandizement of large property owner drove the lesser property owner out of business, and thus proletarianized former members of the lower middle classes. Thus, modern class structure was an expression of competition. Industrial wages, too, were functions of competition. The centralization of the means of production into the hands of a few capitalists was imminent in the laws of competition. By pitting capitalist against capitalist, landowner against landowner, competition turned economic life into the condition of a jungle. The stronger would survive, the weaker were destroyed. Engels referred to this process as, quote, the law of centralization of private property, end quote. Business cycles, recurrent depressions were functions of competition. Inherent in, quote, the law of competition, end quote, was the striving of supply and demand to balance each other. However, they never succeeded. Under capitalism, then, built on the permanent dysfunction of supply and demand, economic life was characterized by perpetual fluctuation of boom followed by bust. But as long as competition determined economic life, as long as there was no plan to production, capitalist society was prone to successive crises. Gradually, due to these recurrent depressions, larger and larger sections of society would be pauperized. Eventually, in this polarized society, the pauperized workers would one day rebel to overthrow the private property system in a revolutionary cataclysm. Economic self-interest, economic gain, was merely the, quote, expression of that war of all against all which dominates modern middle-class society, end quote. Social atomization, the isolation of individuals, was thus the logical outcome of the Christian principle of pure inwardness, a spiritual subjectivity. Egoism was the ruling principle of social life during the Industrial Revolution, and economic self-aggrandizement was the social expression of this egoism. Society was now a jungle, and the brute law of the stronger ruled. Social chaos and ultimate cataclysm were necessary consequences of rule by force. Section 3, Industrial Growth, or new section, Industrial Growth. Now the other sections I said earlier were sections 1 and 2. Competition section and the property section. Industrial growth. Industrial growth had brought the proletariat into existence. As we have seen, industrial growth had also created private property. In fact, industry was the basis of all modern English relationships, quote, the driving force of the entire social movement, end quote. Thus, industry was the ground upon which all social structures and all social relationships were built. It was the most important causal agent in the social universe. By industry, Engels really meant machines. By machines, Engels really meant inventions. The Industrial Revolution itself was, quote, precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the mechanical loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices, end quote. Thus, industrial society for Engels was reducible to technology. He saw mechanics, then engineering, as the innovating force within any society. Abstract science itself was a productive force. Scientific knowledge would improve engineering, would improve mechanism, and thus would improve the power and effectiveness of technology. Engels asked rhetorically, quote, and what is impossible to science, end quote. Science obviously had no limits, and so technology had no limits, and so the productive horizons of industry were also limitless. The natural inventiveness of science was an inherent component of the boundless productivity of modern industry. Engels rejected Malthus and the fear of overproduction on this basis. There could be no fear of overpopulation as long as scientific knowledge itself increased in, quote, geometrical progression, end quote. Technology would produce economic abundance, but technology would also create social distress. First, in the contest between man and machines, men would lose. Unemployment was destined to increase because machines would gradually replace laborers. Secondly, the machine was the cause of dehumanization. Factory work allowed no opportunity for physical exercise or muscular activity. Excessive boredom was the prevailing mood in the factory. Work itself became tedious and wearisome, while physical and mental powers atrophied in an industrial environment. Section 4. Value. Value is derivative. In other words, for Engels, there was no essence of value, no unchanging substance of value. Rather, value is a function of production cost and utility, or of competition. Value is not essence, but something produced out of utility or competition. Utility and competition were primary. The use of an object, the desire for economic self-aggrandizement, determined value. Production costs were composed of three elements. 1. The rent of land required to produce the raw materials. 2. Capital. 3. The wages of labor. For instance, the value of a piece of land was to be determined by the relation of its productivity to its competitive stance on the marketplace. The productivity of the land was to be measured by the production cost entailed by the land to produce objects. Thus, the value of a piece of land was determined by that land's productivity, i.e. cost of production for producing objects, and its utility or competitive market position. Value again was derivative, a function essentially of competition or utility. Even though competition and utility determined value, Engels assigned cost of production a high priority status. In doing this, Marx remained close to the English classical economists. Rent, capital, and labor assumed just as important a position in Engels' economic theory as they did in Smith's and Ricardo's. In describing capitalist society, Engels assumed that rent, capital, and labor were constant components of value. Engels' definition of value then approximated that of British classical economists. Within a capitalist framework, capital, rent, and labor were unchanged elements in value, that is, necessary parts of value. The sufficient part of value was competition and utility. Five. The proletariat. New section. The Industrial Revolution created the proletariat. The Industrial Revolution created the proletarian. This industrial proletarian suffered from the worst form of economic enslavement in the history of Western civilization. The perpetuation of his own existence was completely removed from his own control and was placed at the disposal of blind market forces. Not so much a slave, the proletariat was a mere economic contingency. English society has been polarized between proletarian and capitalist. Indeed, modern industrial society was the scene of a social war, civil war. The decisive struggle was between the impoverished and pauperized workers and the exploitative bourgeoisie. Although the English proletariat was not yet prepared for revolution, an actual uprising would come in the not-too-distant future. Strikes, although not the revolution itself, were a preparation for the decisive struggle. Trade unions were a source of strength for the proletariat. Competition amongst themselves weakened the workers, placed them at the mercy of the capitalists. The formation of unions, indicating a cooperative, unified spirit, meant that the workers would no longer allow themselves to be bought and sold at the cheapest price. The trade union movement would destroy all forms of competition. and thereby ensure that the laborer would receive a just share of the fruits of his labor. Hopefully, the working class movement would become socialist. When Engels wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England, the laboring classes were not of such a temperament. English socialism was too intellectual and too metaphysical. English socialist leaders came basically from the middle classes. English socialist leaders came basically from the middle classes. For these two reasons, then, the socialist movement and the trade union movement had remained separate and distinct. However, the English proletarians supported the Chartist movement. Engels tended to romanticize the proletariat. In particular, Engels saw the industrial proletariat as the most rigorous, intelligent, radical wing of the labor movement. These were not the people to be destroyed by the unemployment foisted upon society by the capitalists. A, quote, reserve of unemployed workers, end quote, was an economic requirement of capitalism. Such a reserve kept wages down. The labor union, by destroying competition, also destroyed the conditions that made a, quote, reserve of unemployed, end quote, a possibility. 6. The theory of cataclysm and revolution. New section. Because of the polarization of society, revolution was inevitable. The law of centralization meant that property must be concentrated in fewer hands. The law of competition meant that the poor must always increase geometrically. Cyclical trade crises drove the worker to desperation, and thus capitalism would end in a cataclysmic fashion. Industrial growth had united all sections of the globe. Industrial growth had created a world market, eradicating sectional and national differences. The social development of all bourgeois countries was thereby coordinated. Since the social war between the bourgeois and the proletariat was endemic to all of them, the communist revolution, then, could not be simply national in scope, but must spread to all countries of the Western world. Because of the different rate of industrial growth in France, Germany, England, and America, the revolution would strike first in England, the most highly modernized, last in Germany, industrially the most backward. Subsequently, the revolution would spread to Asia. The world market imperialism had forced Asian countries out of their isolation. A new mechanical invention in England was capable of depriving Chinese workers of their livelihood. Lower prices for industrial goods occasioned the collapse of ancient Oriental hand and village manufacture. Thus, India was experiencing a thorough revolution, and China was on the verge of being revolutionized. In the 19th century, revolution would occur on a worldwide basis. Section 7. Communism. The chaos of the capitalistic system had proven the efficiency of the private ownership system. The alternation of boom and depression had underscored the inability of industry in private hands to supply sufficient goods for the entire population. Under communism, the industrial machine would be run in accordance with a plan. This plan would bring order and efficiency, and the productive capacity of society would be raised considerably. In fact, communism could not be fully achieved until productivity had reached a certain level. Communism was therefore dependent upon productivity. Quote, in all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity. End quote. In other words, only when the productive capacity had matured enough to meet the basic needs of all members of society would it be possible to construct a communist society. For only when their basic needs were fulfilled would individuals transcend their inherent selfishness and consent to the cooperative management of industry. Under communism, then, an economic plan, sufficient productive power, would mean that social output would meet the basic needs of the entire population. People would share equally. Engels' economic egalitarianism was an attempt to overcome human selfishness and isolation. If all people possessed equally, there would be no need for jealousy, no need for one person to envy another. Such is the message of Wilhelm Weitling, and such was the message of Gracchus Babeuf. Economic egalitarianism, by imposing equality, meant the end of human divisiveness. It meant harmony. Communism for Engels also meant the end of classes and the end of social division, the social division of labor. People would not be impressed into one job, into one specialization. Rather, in the course of a lifetime, they could work at many occupations. Thus, a more rounded, self-developed personality would emerge from a communist society. Because a person was not locked into one occupational caste, he would be able to experience himself in different functions, and thus experience his personality in its most complete form. This analysis of the core ideas of Engels' socioeconomic thinking has revealed some fundamental conceptual differences between Marx and Engels. For instance, for Engels, the most important moderating force in all societies in all times was technology. Engels affirmed repeatedly that all social changes, alterations in class relations, alterations in property relations, were brought about by technological advances. The rigid socioeconomic determinism of Engels' thought becomes apparent. The reductive tendencies of Engels' thinking were manifested in his approach to industry. By the middle of 1842, Engels was a materialist. He began to study the human environment rather than religious or artistic ideas. In Engels' grasp of historical movement, Engels reduced the most important cause of that movement to technology. In the same way, when Engels was in his Hegelian period, he reduced the movement of world history to the unfolding of logic, or idea. In his Hegelian period, the inclusive ontological agent was reason, and in his materialist period, the inclusive agent was machinery. Later, in his writings on physics and chemistry, matter would become motion. Repeatedly, Engels was to place the causative agent, the source of motion and energy, in something outside of man. Man himself, for Engels, was never the source of energy for the social universe. The origination of social energy lay in a source distinct and separate from man. Furthermore, Engels did not reject British classical economics. Engels openly borrowed their economic categories, their economic definitions. Industry, property, competition, and cost of production shared one, but not only one, common denominator. They were all forces outside of man, even recognizing the exception that human labor was a production cost. Essentially, what Engels had in common with the English economists was the common belief that capitalism could be explained in terms of forces, of laws external to man. In short, the determinants of value lay outside of man. The tragedy of man under capitalism, for Engels, was the tragedy of a traveler who found himself in an environment that controlled him, exploited him for its own interests. To compare Engels' economics with Marx's, taking 1844 as our point of departure, immediately exposes the fundamental differences between the two men. Marx applied the theme of alienation to economics. Labor was an alienated force. Value is totally constituted of alienated labor. In short, Marx's economics was an attempt to derive social value entirely from human activity. Marx did overthrow English classical economics and did seek to create a new theoretical economics. Marx rejected any attempt to locate the determinants of value in sources external to man. The new economics Marx was attempting to create made man the subject of economic value, the creator of all value. To do this, Marx had to apply his theory of alienation to economics. Marx had to show that capitalism was the tragedy of man who allowed his creative praxis to be alienated. Capitalism was the tragedy of man who lived in a foreign world that had been constructed by his own expropriated labor. It is man-made, but not made in the image of man. That's a very good line. Capitalism was the tragedy of man who lived in a foreign world that had been constructed by his own expropriated labor. It was man-made, but not made in the image of man. The concepts of surplus value and labor, as understood by Marx, are not present in Engels. These ideas did not exist in Engels because he lacked an understanding of the idea of alienation. I don't know at period. He's talking about this chapter is titled "The Origins of Engels Communism." So speaking about the young Engels, Marx didn't develop the theory of surplus value until much later into his economic studies. Anyway, the concepts of surplus value and labor as understood by Marx are not present in Engels. These ideas did not exist in Engels because he lacked an understanding of the idea of alienation. Unless Engels had been prepared to see the world as entirely constructed and composed of human praxis, he could not have arrived at a Marxian theory of value or surplus value. The anthropological center was missing in Engels. Marx had the anthropological center. Marx was prepared to see man as the primary agent of change, the source of social creation. Because Marx was prepared to do this, Marx could invent the theory of surplus value, as well as the labor theory of value. He could invent a new economics. Because Engels was not prepared to take this step, he followed, at this stage of his life, the English economists. He followed his metaphysical predisposition and believed that value is determined by forces external to man. The divergence between the two men becomes more apparent through an analysis of their definitions of property and class. By, quote, property, end quote, Engels means possession. By, quote, property, end quote, Marx means the conditions of labor. That is, for Marx, property was land, tolls, material, anything upon which men could labor could objectify themselves. private property for Marx was thus the removal of the conditions of labor from the free accessibility of all. In other words, under a system of private property, all people could not freely objectify themselves, because the conditions of labor were not accessible to them. Lastly, quote, class, end quote, for Engels meant wealth. A class was determined by the amount of property, that is, wealth, it possessed. Engels talked in terms of three classes, quote, class, end quote, for Marx meant function. In brief, a class was defined by a class's economic role, the social function that class filled. For Marx as well, there were three classes in 19th century society. Nothing in this chapter is intended to deny that Engels' socioeconomic views changed during his lifetime. Engels fell under the influence of Marx, and they did collaborate on the Communist Manifesto, the German ideology, and the Holy Family. In point of fact, the influence was reciprocal. It was Engels who conclusively showed Marx the importance of economics, and Marx indeed acknowledged his indebtedness to Engels in this area. But to say Engels drew Marx's attention to this field is not the same thing as saying that they both defined and understood economics in exactly the same way. Marx's understanding of economics from the 1844 manuscripts until the Grundrisse and Capital was based on the theme of dehumanization, and in the Grundrisse and Capital was heavily influenced by Hegelian logic. Engels' socioeconomic thinking, enlarged in his lifetime, was augmented by Marx, but there always existed a predisposition in his mind to give greater weight to see the balance of importance shifted to technological factors, to deterministic factors, to material factors simply in the sense of physicalness and tangibility. When Marx wrote about economics in terms of alienation, but also in terms of form and content, inherent contradiction, and relationship. When Engels wrote about economics, he did so in terms of pauperism, of economic egalitarianism, of bourgeois reification, that is, he accepted the English classical economist categories of competition, rent, exchange. This predisposition made up the uniqueness, the inherent subjectivity of Engels' mind. Regardless of these differences between Marx and Engels, there can be no doubt of Engels' own intellectual growth from 1842 until 1847. The years of his rationalistic pantheism, of his liberal nationalism, were years of his youth. The years of his conversion to materialism, of his communism, were the years of his maturation. Not only was there maturity, but also a keener scientific vision. The presumptions, the hyperbolic qualities of youth, were replaced by a more precise, more acute understanding of social processes. Nevertheless, the central ideas of alienation and objectification were absent from his economics. Even though Engels wished to use his economics to illustrate the need for socialism and a more humane society, the internal structure of his economics, the inner principles, were not derived from a naturalistic humanism. Nowhere does Engels explain value, surplus value, production as expression of species activity. Nowhere does Engels try to explain the constitution of the socioeconomic world as ultimately derivative from human species being. The dedication to the anthropological foundation of the social sciences simply was not present in Engels. Conversely, Engels was a metaphysician. That is, Engels always placed the agency of change or activity outside the human being. Engels was metaphysical as compared to Marx's being anthropological, because Engels always located the activating principle of the social cosmos in sources external to man, in material forces. In the period from 1842 until 1847, Engels had moved beyond the rationalistic pantheism of his Hegelian period. The spiritual in all the spiritual's forms no longer existed for Engels, but characteristically for Engels, although the spiritual had been transcended in content, the spiritual's function had been simply replaced. Materialism became the dominant principle of Engels' philosophy. What Engels meant by materialism was essentially science and technology. Engels had not surrendered the idea of finding a single principle by which to explain the entire universe. The single principle was no longer mind or God. Rather, the single principle is now material science, and in its applied form, machinery. Engels remained bound to metaphysics, but his metaphysics was now a metaphysics of matter. Engels made the connection between communism and natural science. The end of the essay. There's some footnotes here, things that are references. Heinrich Heine, Religion and Philosophy in Germany, translated by John Snodgrass in 1959. P. Buonarroti, Babeuf, Conspiracy for Equality, Wilhelm Weitling, Garantien der Harmonie und Freiheit. Frank Manuel, Prophets of Paris, published in 1965. Engels' Principles of Communism, translated by Paul M. Sweezy, for International Publishers, 1969. Engels' Outline of a Critique of Political Economy, from Marx's Early Manuscripts, translated by Ed Mulligan, with Foreign Languages Publishing House, Moscow. Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England, translated by W.O. Henderson and W.H. Chaloner, in 1968. For a discussion of the early economic theory of Engels, see Ernest Mandel, The Formation of the Economic Thought of Karl Marx. Mandel is sound on Marx, but only offers a brief and not too penetrating analysis of Engels. Communist writers continue to misinterpret Engels, and their commentary on Engels is marked by veneration and little objectivity. A prime example of this a priori approach to Engels is in I. Rosenberg, Ökonomischen Lehre von Marx und Engels, published by Dietz Verlag, 1966. I'm not sure, but I think Dietz Verlag is a publisher in East Germany. For an analysis of the role that religion played in Engels' early life and later thought, see the following two works: Karl Kuppisch, Vom Pietismus zum Kommunismus, 1953, Reinhard Zager, Friedrich Engels, Die religiöse Entwicklung des Pietisten und Frühsozialisten, 1935, for an East German interpretation of Engels, one that incorporates a much humanistic atmosphere but is uncritical and hagiographic, see Horst Ulrich, Der junge Engels. The end. Thanks for listening.